For 6 years, the finest grapes in Redstone County grew in the one place nobody wanted. Stay with me. When the county surveyor opened claims on the far side of Red Canyon in the spring of 1882, 23 families lined up at the land office in Bridgers Ford before dawn. Most of them had been waiting since January. Most of them knew exactly what they wanted: good pasture, river frontage, and land close enough to the wagon road that hauling supplies wouldn't kill a team of horses before Christmas. Nora Prescott stood at the back of the line. She was 26 years old. She had $340 in a leather pouch sewn into her coat lining, a deed claim written in pencil on the back of a feed receipt, and a gray dog named Smoke, who sat beside her like he'd been carved from the same stone as the canyon walls. Nobody paid her much mind. A woman alone at a land auction was unusual enough to draw a few stares, but it was 1882 in the territories, and stranger things happened every week. What made people notice, what made them talk, was what she chose. Nora's husband, Thomas Prescott, had died of typhoid 18 months earlier on a freight road outside of Cheyenne. He was 31. They had been married 4 years. They had no children. The fever took him in 3 days. On the first day he told Nora it was nothing, just a chill from sleeping on wet ground. On the second day, he couldn't stand. On the third day, sometime before dawn, he stopped breathing in the back of the freight wagon, while Nora held a damp cloth to his forehead and smoke lay across his feet. She buried him beside the road, marked the spot with a cairn of river stones, and drove the wagon back to Cheyenne alone. She was 24 years old. Thomas had been a good man, a steady man, but not a wealthy one. He drove freight wagons between Cheyenne and the mining camps north of Laramie, hauling flour, nails, whiskey, and dry goods on roads that turned to mud in spring and froze solid in winter. The money was honest but thin, $30 a month in a good season, less in a bad one. When he died, Nora was left with the wagon, 2 mules named Jack and Ruth, the clothes on her back, a cast-iron cook stove she couldn't carry, and a small leather-bound journal that had belonged to her grandmother. She sold the cook stove for $11. She sold one of the mules to a livery stable in Cheyenne for $28. She kept Jack because he was steadier on rough ground, and because Thomas had raised him from a foal, and she couldn't bring herself to let him go. That journal was the most valuable thing she owned, though it would have been worth nothing at auction. Her grandmother, Anneke van der Berg, had come to Pennsylvania from the Netherlands in 1839. She had grown up along the canals of South Holland, where her family kept terraced gardens on the shaded sides of dike walls, narrow beds pressed against stone where the soil stayed cool and damp, while the open fields baked in summer. Anneke had written about those gardens in careful Dutch script, with drawings of the terrace walls, the angles of the water channels, the way shade and stone held moisture better than any amount of open sun. Nora had read that journal so many times the pages were soft as cloth. She didn't understand every word of Dutch, but she understood the drawings. She understood the principle. And when she stood at the back of that line in Bridgers Ford and looked at the survey map pinned to the wall of the land office, she understood something else. She understood what the red cliffs at the base of the canyon could do. Every other settler chose open ground. Frank Garrett took a wide pasture along Cutler Creek with good water access and room enough for 60 head of cattle. Jonas Wheeler claimed a meadow south of the wagon road where the grass grew belly-high on a horse by June. Pete Braddock and his brother Sam split a section of benchland overlooking the river, flat enough to plow and close enough to town that they could haul grain to market without losing a full day. Good choices, all of them. Smart, practical, and exactly what anyone with sense would pick. Nora bought a narrow strip of ground, barely 14 acres, pressed against the base of the red cliffs on the shaded side of the canyon. The land office clerk looked at her claim and then looked at her. "Ma'am, are you sure? That section gets maybe 4 hours of direct sun. The soil's half gravel. You can't run cattle against a cliff face." "I'm sure," Nora said. She paid $1.25 an acre. The clerk shrugged, stamped her deed, and moved on to the next claim. Word spread through Bridger's Ford by supper. She bought the dead corner. That was Frank Garrett's assessment, spoken over a plate of beans at the stockman's table in the Bridger Hotel. Frank was a large man with a red beard and an opinion about everything. He had been ranching in the territory since 1876, and he considered himself an authority on what land was worth. "Nothing but shadow and stone," he said. "You can't grow hay in the shade. You can't graze stock on gravel. That woman bought herself a $20 grave." Jonas Wheeler agreed. "I walked that section last month. Wind piles dust against the cliff and drifts 3 feet deep. The whole place feels like standing at the bottom of a well." Pete Braddock was kinder about it, but not much. Maybe she didn't know any better. She's from back east. Probably saw the red rock and thought it looked pretty. Nobody asked Nora what she thought. She wouldn't have told them anyway. The first month was nothing but stone. Nora set up a canvas tent 50 yards from the cliff base and began walking the ground. Smoke padded beside her, his amber eyes tracking hawks that circled above the canyon rim. The strip of land was roughly a 1/4 mile long and 200 yards wide at its broadest point, narrowing to barely 60 yards at the south end where the cliff curved inward like a cupped hand. The soil was poor, thin, sandy, laced with broken red rock. The cliff wall rose 200 feet straight up, a sheer face of Entrada sandstone that glowed like embers at sunset and threw cold blue shadow across the ground for most of the day. But Nora saw what she had come to see. After a thunderstorm rolled through on her 3rd night, she woke before dawn and walked to the cliff base with a lantern. The rain had been brief, maybe 20 minutes of hard downpour, but along the wall, thin ribbons of water were still slipping down the rock face. They followed the natural channels in the sandstone, gathering in cracks and seams, running together into streams no wider than her finger, and then disappearing into the earth at the base of the cliff. She knelt and pressed her hand into the soil. It was wet 8 inches down. She walked the full length of the cliff base that morning. Everywhere the story was the same. Water gathered on the broad, sloping cap rock above, funneled down through cracks and channels in the cliff face, and soaked into the narrow band of earth at the bottom. And because the cliff shaded that earth for most of the day, it held its moisture far longer than the open fields where the sun burned off every drop by noon. There was more. Along the base of the wall, in the places where water collected most reliably, she found patches of wild green, tough little sedges, a scattering of rabbit brush, and one stunted cottonwood that had somehow rooted itself in a crack and grown sideways out of the stone. Even in the driest weeks, these plants held on. The cliff was not barren. It was a reservoir. Nora began clearing stone in June of 1882. She worked alone for the first 2 months. Each morning she rose before the sun crested the canyon rim, ate a cold breakfast of biscuit and dried beef, filled her canteen from a spring she'd found seeping from a crack 40 yards south of her tent, and walked to whatever section of cliff base she was clearing that week. The work was brutal. She pried loose rocks from the soil with an iron bar, loaded them into a wheelbarrow Thomas had built from scrap lumber, and hauled them to the spots where she was building retaining walls. She dug shallow terraces, each one no more than 18 inches deep and 6 feet wide, following the natural contour of the ground along the cliff base. She lined them with the flattest stones she could find, angled slightly inward so that water running down the cliff face would pool and soak in rather than running off. By August, she had cleared and terraced a section 60 feet long. Her hands were cracked and bleeding most of that summer. Her boots wore through at the soles, and she patched them with rawhide cut from an old saddle. She lost 12 pounds she didn't have to spare, but the terraces held water. After every rain, she measured. She pushed a stick into the soil of her terraces and marked the wet line. She pushed the same stick into the open ground beyond the cliff shadow. The difference was always the same. Her terraced soil held moisture 3 to 5 times longer than the exposed earth. She wrote everything down in a second journal, smaller than her grandmother's, bound in brown canvas. That fall, Nora rode to Bridger's Ford and bought grapevine cuttings from a Mexican freighter named Luis Salazar, who was passing through on his way north from the San Luis Valley. Luis had a wagon full of nursery stock, cuttings wrapped in damp burlap and packed in wooden crates. He sold mostly to homesteaders who wanted shade trees and windbreaks, but tucked in the back of his wagon were bundles of Concord grape cuttings and a crate of fig starts that he said had come from a mission garden in New Mexico. "You have water?" Luis asked when Nora told him what she wanted. "I have a cliff," she said. Luis studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. He sold her 30 grape cuttings and a dozen fig starts for $8.50. He threw in a bundle of rosemary and sage cuttings for free. "My grandmother grew grapes against a stone wall in Zacatecas," he said. "The wall held the heat after sunset. The grapes were the sweetest in the valley." It was the first time anyone had understood what Nora was doing. She planted through October. Each cutting went into the terraced soil at the cliff base, spaced 2 feet apart. She built rough trellises from juniper poles lashed together with rawhide, angling them against the cliff face so the vines could climb. She mulched around each plant with dried grass and crushed bark hauled from a dead pine grove a mile north. When winter came, she covered the young plants with burlap weighted down with stones and prayed. The temperatures dropped to -18 degrees Fahrenheit that January. The creek on Frank Garrett's pasture froze solid for 6 weeks. Jonas Wheeler lost 4 head of cattle to exposure. Pete Braddock's well pump cracked and he hauled water by hand for a month. Nora's cliff-base garden, pressed against 200 feet of sandstone that had been absorbing the thin winter sun all day, stayed 10 degrees warmer than the open valley floor. The cliff radiated stored heat through the night like a massive oven wall. The burlap-covered cuttings survived. All 30 grapevines, 11 of 12 figs, every sprig of rosemary and sage. The second year, Nora expanded. She cleared another 100 feet of cliff base, built more terraces, and planted a second round of cuttings. More grapes, more figs, and now herbs. Oregano, thyme, and lavender starts. She ordered by mail from a nursery in Denver. She also set in 4 young peach trees grown from pits she had saved and sprouted through the winter in damp sand inside her tent. She experimented with the water channels that season. Using flat pieces of sandstone set on edge, she built narrow guide walls that directed the cliff runoff into specific terraces rather than letting it spread and dissipate. The effect was immediate. The directed terraces held moisture 2 days longer than the others. She noted this in her canvas journal and circled it twice. She also discovered that the cliff face itself could be used as a growing surface. Where cracks in the sandstone ran horizontally, She packed them with a mixture of soil and composted manure and pressed herb cuttings into the gaps. The rosemary took to it especially well, sending roots deep into the fissures and spreading along the rock face until whole sections of cliff smelled of pine and camphor when the sun hit them. She hired a boy from town, Will Craddock, 14 years old and strong for his age, to help haul stone 3 days a week. Will thought the whole project was peculiar, but Nora paid 50 cents a day plus meals, and 50 cents was 50 cents. Why not just plant in the valley like everyone else? Will asked one afternoon, wiping sweat from his forehead with a red kerchief. Nora was on her knees, fitting a flat piece of sandstone into a retaining wall. She didn't look up. Because the valley can't do what this cliff does. What does the cliff do? It remembers water, she said, and it remembers warmth. Will thought about that for a while. Then he went back to hauling stone. By the third season, the garden was visible from the wagon road. Green vines climbed the trellises against the red stone. Fig trees spread broad leaves in the filtered light. Herb beds sent up clouds of fragrance when the wind shifted. The terraces, built from the same red rock as the cliff, looked like they had always been there. Natural shelves carved by time, rather than by one woman with an iron bar and a wheelbarrow. People started talking again, but the tone had changed. Have you seen what that Prescott woman built against the canyon wall? I heard she's growing grapes out there. Grapes? In this county? Frank Garrett drove past on his way to check his south fence line and stopped his wagon to stare. He sat there for 5 minutes, not saying a word. Then he clicked his tongue to his horses and moved on. He didn't laugh this time. The test came in the summer of 1885. That was the year the rain stopped. From April through September, Redstone County received less than 2 inches of rainfall, the worst drought anyone could remember. The grass on the open range turned brown by May and was gone by July. Cattle started dying in August. Orchards that had been producing for a decade withered. Wells dropped. Creeks ran dry. The air tasted like dust from morning to night. Children got nosebleeds from the dryness. Horses stood with their heads down in whatever thin shade they could find, too tired to swat flies. The wagon road cracked into plates of hard clay that broke apart under wheel rims and blew away in the wind. Frank Garrett lost 1/3 of his herd. He sold another 1/3 at a loss, just to reduce the number of mouths he couldn't water. Jonas Wheeler's hay meadow, the meadow he had been so proud of, the one that grew belly-high grass by June, looked like a field of dead straw by midsummer. His wife, Mary, canned everything in the root cellar and rationed water by the cupful. Pete Braddock hauled water from the river 8 miles round trip every day for 4 months. By September, his wagon horses were gaunt, and his back was so stiff he could barely climb down from the seat. 3 families packed up and left the county that summer. They loaded their wagons in the dark, like they were ashamed, and headed north toward the Bighorn Basin, where people said there was still water in the ground. Nobody blamed them. The whole valley was hurting. But at the base of the red cliffs, Nora's garden held. The cliff face still funneled whatever moisture there was. Morning dew, the occasional brief shower, condensation from temperature changes between day and night, down into the terraced soil. The shade kept the ground cool and reduced evaporation. The stone retaining walls trapped what little water arrived and held it in the root zone. The vines were stressed. The figs dropped some fruit early, but the garden survived. In August of that brutal summer, Nora harvested 42 pounds of grapes. It was not a large harvest by any measure, but it was 42 pounds of fresh fruit in a county where nothing else was growing. She packed the grapes in wooden crates lined with clean straw and loaded them onto her wagon. She drove to Bridger's Ford and set the crates on a table outside the general store. They sold out in an hour. Word spread the way it always does in a small territory, slowly at first, then all at once. A merchant from Rawlins heard about the grapes and rode 2 days to see if it was true. He found Nora on her knees in the terraces, tying back grapevines, with Smoke lying in the shade of a fig tree and watching him with amber eyes that didn't blink. "I want to buy your whole harvest," the merchant said. "Grapes, figs, herbs, whatever you've got. I'll pay market rate plus 20% for transport." "I'll sell you what I can spare," Nora said, "but I keep enough to plant more." That fall she shipped 4 crates of grapes, 2 crates of figs, and bundles of dried herbs to Rawlins. The merchant sold them for 3 times what he'd paid. He came back the next season and brought 2 other buyers with him. By the 5th year, Nora's terraced garden stretched nearly the full quarter-mile length of the cliff base. She had added a stone storage shed built into a natural alcove in the rock, where the temperature stayed cool and steady year-round. She had strung cotton cloth canopies between juniper poles to create a shaded packing yard, where she and Will, who was now 18 and working for her full-time, sorted and crated the harvest. The garden produced grapes, figs, peaches, apricots from 3 new trees, herbs of 6 varieties, and a small quantity of raisins that Nora dried on flat rocks in the late summer sun. She also pressed a small amount of grape juice that she sealed in glass bottles and sold for 75 cents each. Fresh grapes in a dry county. Figs where no one thought figs could grow. Bottled juice and dried herbs packed in crates and shipped to towns that had never seen such things grown locally. Frank Garrett came to see her in the autumn of 1887. He stood at the edge of the packing yard with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. Smoke, old now and gray around the muzzle, watched him from beside the stone shed. A younger dog, Smoke's daughter, a leggy brindle with the same amber eyes, stood beside Nora. "I owe you an apology," Frank said. Nora was wrapping fig cuttings in damp cloth for a buyer in Laramie. She looked up. "For what?" "For calling this a dead corner. For saying you bought a grave." He paused. "I was wrong. I couldn't see what you saw." Nora sat down, the cuttings, and wiped her hands on her apron. "You saw what everyone saw. Open land, good grass, room for cattle. That's not wrong. It's just not the only way to look at a place." Frank nodded slowly. He looked at the vines climbing the red stone, the broad leaves of the fig trees, the terraces stepping up from the canyon floor like a green staircase built against the wall of the earth. "Could you teach someone to do this?" he asked. "My south pasture has a rock face along the back. Not as tall as this, maybe 60 feet, but it faces east and holds the morning sun." Nora studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. "Bring your wagon Saturday. I'll show you how to read the water." She taught Frank Garrett. She walked his south pasture with him on a Saturday morning in late October, showed him where the water ran after rain, and helped him mark the spots where the first terraces should go. Frank, for all his bluster, turned out to be a careful student. He listened more than he talked, and he wrote things down in a pocket notebook with a pencil stub. Then she taught Jonas Wheeler's wife, Mary, who had a low sandstone ledge along the back of their homestead. Mary had the patience for it. She spent the whole winter building retaining walls while Jonas tended cattle. And by spring she had 12 feet of terraced ground ready for planting. Nora gave her fig cuttings and a handful of lavender starts and told her to water them once a week until the roots took hold. Then she taught a rancher's daughter from 2 valleys over, a girl named Sarah Beaumont, 17 years old, who had read about Nora's garden in a letter published in the Rawlins newspaper and had ridden 30 miles alone to see it for herself. Sarah had the same look in her eyes that Nora recognized from her own mirror, the look of someone who saw things other people didn't and was tired of being told she was wrong. A professor from the University of Wyoming came in the spring of 1889. He was a thin, serious man named Dr. Emmett Cole, who studied what he called arid land agriculture and had heard about the cliff gardens from a colleague in Denver. He spent 3 days at the terraces, measuring soil moisture, recording temperatures at the cliff base versus the open valley, and sketching the water channeling system in a leather-bound field notebook that reminded Nora of her grandmother's journal. "Do you know what you've built here, Mrs. Prescott?" he asked on his last afternoon, standing in the shade of the fig trees with his hat pushed back on his head. "A garden," Nora said. "You've built a proof," he said. "A proof that the assumptions about what land is worthless are themselves worthless. Every agricultural manual written for this territory says you need full sun, flat ground, and reliable irrigation. You have none of those things, and you're out producing orchards that have all 3. Nora considered that. "I have a cliff," she said. "That's more than enough." Dr. Cole published a paper about the Red Canyon terraces in an agricultural journal that autumn. He called Nora's method lithic microclimate cultivation. Nora called it common sense. Nora never charged for teaching. She gave away cuttings, drew diagrams, walked people through the principles of terrace construction and water channeling. She lent out her grandmother's journal, carefully to people she trusted, and helped them understand the drawings, even when they couldn't read the Dutch. "Knowledge gets bigger when you share it," she told Will one evening as they sat on the stone wall at the edge of the packing yard, watching the last light turn the cliff face from red to deep purple. "That's the only thing that works that way. Everything else gets smaller." Will, who was by then 20 years old and thinking about his own land claim, turned that over in his mind. He would remember it for the rest of his life, 20 years later. It was the autumn of 1902, and the terraced gardens of Red Canyon had spread beyond anything Nora Prescott could have imagined when she stood at the back of that line in the land office with $340 and a pencil-written deed claim. There were now cliff-based gardens in 11 counties across Wyoming and northern Colorado. Ranchers and homesteaders who had spent decades fighting the open ground had learned to read the rock, to see the water channels, to feel the stored warmth, to understand that shade was not a curse, but a gift. Some of them grew grapes. Some grew vegetables. One man near Fort Collins had terraced a south-facing limestone bluff and was growing apples that a Denver grocer called the finest in the state. The agricultural journal that Dr. Cole had published in had run 3 more articles about cliff-based cultivation since 1889. A county extension agent in Laramie kept a copy of Nora's terrace diagrams pinned to the wall of his office. A school teacher in Rawlins used the story of the Red Canyon Gardens to teach children about water conservation and the properties of sandstone. Nora was 46. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. Her hands were scarred and strong, the knuckles swollen from years of gripping iron bars and fitting stone. She walked with a slight limp from a fall she'd taken on loose stone 5 years earlier, but she still worked the terraces every morning. She could no longer lift the heavy rocks she had hauled in her 20s, but she could still read the water and she could still plant with a precision that made younger workers shake their heads in admiration. Smoke had died in the winter of 1894, lying in a patch of sun beside the stone shed. He was 13 years old. Nora had buried him at the south end of the garden, near the oldest grapevine, and marked the spot with a flat piece of red sandstone. His granddaughter, a quiet gray dog named Penny, had the same amber eyes and the same habit of watching strangers without blinking. She followed Nora everywhere, just as Smoke had done. The garden now covered the full length of the cliff base and extended into two natural alcoves where the rock curved inward. Nora had added a small house built partly into the cliff, cool in summer, warm in winter, with a stone floor and a roof of heavy timber covered in sod. There was a proper road now, graded and graveled, connecting the garden to the main wagon road. A wooden sign at the turnoff read, "Prescott Terraces, Visitors Welcome." Will Craddock had his own land now, 40 acres with a 70-foot bluff along the back where he had built terraces of his own. He grew peaches and plums and was experimenting with a variety of walnut tree that a university man from Laramie said might do well in the sheltered microclimate of a cliff base. Frank Garrett, who had once called the land a dead corner, now grew herbs along the rock face of his south pasture and shipped dried rosemary and thyme to Denver in 10-pound sacks. He told everyone who would listen that the best thing he ever did was swallow his pride and ask Nora Prescott for help. On a cool October evening, Nora walked the length of her terraces one more time before dark. Penny padded beside her, quiet and steady. The air smelled of sage and ripe fruit, and the mineral tang of wet sandstone. There had been a brief rain that afternoon, and the cliff face was still darkened with moisture, thin ribbons of water still finding their ancient paths down to the terraced earth below. She stopped at the south end of the garden, where the cliff curved inward, and the oldest grapevine, the first cutting she had ever planted, now thick as her wrist, and climbing 15 feet up a trellis fixed against the red stone, was heavy with dark fruit. She reached up and pulled one grape free. It was warm from the stone behind it. She ate it standing there in the last light, with the cliff glowing above her and the green garden stretching out along its base. And she thought about her grandmother's drawings of the canal walls in South Holland, and about Thomas, and about the day she had knelt in the wet sand at the base of this cliff and felt the water 8 inches down and understood what everyone else had missed. She had never argued when people said she had been lucky. Luck was a word people used when they couldn't see the work. She had simply understood that sometimes the best place to grow something rare is the place no one else believes in, and that the only real waste of land is a failure of imagination. Nora wiped the grape juice from her fingers, called Penny to her side, and walked slowly back through the green terraces toward the warm light of her stone house, built against the red cliff that had given her everything.